All right, here's why we're closer than ever to world peace. Let me break it down. Because, if you follow just the mainstream news and media and ideas these days, everybody is talking about basically the opposite, right? World War III, that we're on the brink of that breaking out, and that, everything is doom and gloom these days, and rightfully so. I mean, there have been multiple wars breaking out lately, and there's been all sorts of chaos. So it's understandable. But at the same time, we deal with a biased news cycle that just makes everything such tunnel vision, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. So let me explain a couple of things that the United States has done, a couple of things in terms of Russia and Ukraine, and other arenas, other parts of the world, events that I think actually point towards things changing. So first of all, the United States is starting to really consolidate its power, and it is starting to flex its influence over other countries. It's always been doing that, but it's more overt now. I mean, you have these recent tariff wars and all this stuff where, basically the United States has gone head to head economically with Europe and even Canada and Mexico and all these other countries. And we're seeing lately there's a lot of progress with NATO and increasing NATO funding and all of this stuff. Europe is really sweating right now. And so they're starting to more comply with this agenda. And the thing is that, right, it's a more nationalistic, America first kind of government as opposed to globalism. And here's the real, ironic thing I want to point out. A lot of people think that globalism means bring us closer to world peace. Because if all of our economies are interconnected and all of our people, we have trade, like Trans-Pacific Partnership, all this stuff. We have trade with all these other countries, and immigration and everything is flowing, then that's going to lead to peace, right? Because you're going to break down national borders and all that stuff. But that's one version of peace. It's this kind of kumbaya kind of idea where we're all going to get along and mingle and mix together, and it's going to work. And I don't think that's realistic at all. People tend to form groups, whether they want to, whether you want them to or not. People tend to collectivize. And this is how nations and governments formed in the first place, right? If you want to just make everything, look at the United States, for instance, is becoming a very, it is very diverse, not a very homogenous place. And right now it's getting a lot of immigration and a lot of different things. It's does that necessarily mean that everybody is going to get along? Or does that mean that you're going to have little pockets of groups, right? Especially if you have people who come here, they don't speak English, right? They're not going to intermix with the local population that much. They're going to go off and form their own group. That's why you got Chinatown and Little Italy and all that in every single city, right? The groups stay together, They don't just, obviously there is some intermixing and all that, but especially if they don't speak the same language, there are culture barriers. And that's always going to be the case, right? There are certain cultures that are just incompatible or basically incompatible with each other, right? Look at, Israel and Palestine have just been fighting forever. Do we really think that they're going to just all of a sudden intermix and forget their differences? No, lately they've just been getting angrier at each other, and it looks like a longer lasting problem. So what's my point? Basically this whole idea of break down all the trade barriers, break down all the, all the borders, just have everybody mix around, and then this is going to lead to world peace. I disagree. I think that's doing the opposite. That is creating more chaos and confusion, dressed up as freedom. But what happens when you have freedom is that the strong start to take control. What you need in order to get world peace is direction. You need, one force. Usually it's not one country, it's a coalition. You need one force to come together and say, hey, we're done. This is done. These wars are not good for us, right? Every country acts on rational incentives. What if a country were to say, hey, listen, you have all these wars and stuff. You're forcing us to put sanctions on these countries. You're limiting our trade. This is not good unfortunately, it is good for the global economy because of selling weapons, but stay with me. For whatever reason, some countries, we have a rational interest that we want to have a lot of control over the world, but we don't want to have, missiles shooting back and forth because that's too chaotic and that's interfering with our spheres of influence. So everybody put down your guns or else we're going to bully you and until you stop. And that's basically what you're kind of seeing going on. The United States is really, they are, they're building, we're basically, the government is building leverage with all of these tariffs and all of these like sanctions and policies and all that stuff, flexing its leverage like we saw with Iran. And China is doing the same thing. And here's actually what I think is playing out right now. It's really interesting because you see more like the United States is consolidating power. They recently proved that like Europe is more or less beholden to them still. Europe without them would just not be able to fully defend itself against Russia, or they're not confident that they could. And you have other, even like Canada and Mexico, all these other countries that they're taking them on. And you're like, oh, we should be partners with them. It's like, no, you kind of need like a boss employee kind of relationship, not a partnership. There's no such thing as an even partnership. You're always going to have one country has incentives, the other has incentives. One of them has to take the lead. So that's exactly what the United States is doing and is showing. So they've got the Anglosphere, right? Which is basically the UK, Australia, Canada, especially the UK is like all on board with the US right now, it seems. And then they've got Europe. Okay, well, who are the opposition, right? You might say Russia, but that's the thing of the past, honestly. I think what this Ukraine war has shown is that Russia is actually a paper tiger. They are fighting against, right, Ukraine, and yes, they're getting a lot of national support, but still, I mean, they're getting a lot, Ukraine's getting weapons, all that stuff. But the fact that Russia is not winning this war, even if they're making progress, the fact that it's taking this long, like imagine if the United States were to fight Ukraine. It would not take very long, right? So this is just crazy. And it's just showing that aside from having nuclear weapons, Russia is really irrelevant these days. They're not one of the big two players. This is not the Cold War anymore. I think that's honestly part of why they started this war, is that they can sense their waning like global influence and they're trying to assert themselves in this kind of like macho kind of aggression, but it's not working. And it just exposed how weak they really are. And if you look at Russia's actual like the people, the cities, the population, right? The young population in Russia is just absolutely dwindling. People are, not having kids. People are leaving the country. People are poor. They can't get work. Russia is just, the government's corrupt and bureaucratic. Russia's just a mess. I don't think that Russia, aside from nuclear weapons, is really going to be relevant. And here's something the United States is doing. They're building the not global, like that, like golden, whatever, missile defense shield. I think that's going to be huge. Once we have that, whatever year, 2028, 29 or whatever, like we already don't have to like take this crap from Russia anymore. Once we have that, we might not have to take them seriously at all. Like even just recently you saw like the nuclear submarines, the government, like the president was like, oh, we're moving nuclear submarines over to Russia, like just cause like they're not taking, no one takes Russia's threats seriously anymore, because if you can shoot down, if you know that you have a like one of a kind system that can shoot down any sort of missiles, and we already saw like the new missile defense systems helped in defending against Iran and all this stuff, defending Israel. If you implement that for the entire United States, you don't have to worry about nuclear threats as much anymore. Obviously you don't want them, but like in terms of behind the scenes, right? Obviously the headlines are scary, but behind the scenes they'll be like, all right, we don't have to like worry about Russia anymore. So I don't think Russia is going to be relevant in this century. I really don't think. I think they're going to be like a mid-Carter kind of country, like like they're going to be like like a mid-Carter. They're not one of the big players. So who are? Well, obviously China. Everybody talks about China. They're growing economy. They're growing military strength. They're also nuclear armed, and they have a ton of influence. And that's why I think the rational politicians, right? You have a lot of these strategists and not politicians, but you know what I'm saying? Like the people who work in government. You have a lot of these military and these people. Why do you think they're so worried about China and not Russia? Because China is becoming way more relevant than Russia. And what I think is going to happen actually, which is super fascinating, is that Russia is going to become a subsidiary of China in the same way that, right? Think about it. You have the two pawns, right? You have the EU versus Russia. Well, who are their big daddies, right? Who are their boss? Like who is their United States versus China? That's like the current Cold War. Instead of the United States versus Russia, it's the United States versus China. And Russia and China, I don't think they are explicitly aligned right now, but Russia is partnered with North Korea as of just like relatively recently, and Iran, as shown by their collaboration in the Ukraine war. So right? North Korea obviously is like listens to China first, and Iran and Russia and North Korea might all just be like three different subsidiaries of China. China is diplomatically neutral right now, but I'm saying in a game theory sense, I think that what's going to happen is you're going to start to see the consolidation of power to these more, because why wouldn't these countries that are already winning try to consolidate their power and try to flex their national interests? America's already doing it. We're seeing it with these tariff wars. So you got America, the Anglosphere, and the EU on one side, Team America, and you have Team China. I think Russia is going to have to join up with China. Otherwise, the only other, actually, there's a second alternative, is that Russia joins up with the United States, which is kind of far-fetched. I briefly saw that possibility when, Russia and Ukraine, and Russia and the United States are having these peace talks and all that. I'm like, what if they settle this war, 10% chance, like what if they settle this war and then Russia actually joins up with the United States against China? But that didn't happen, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's just way too much history between, like, bad blood between America and Russia, and I think Russia would rather align themselves with China, who also happens to be aligned with their ally North Korea, and then Iran would join in that mix because they hate America. So all of Russia's allies hate America, so Russia might as well too. But that's how this works. It's just game theory and incentives. Nothing is as it seems, and everything is counterintuitive. So we just got to watch what the countries do and not listen to what they say. So I see this building, right? You have, and then of course in the Asian scene, you have like Japan and South Korea are aligned with the United States and NATO, obviously. So where does that leave these other countries? What about India? India is an interesting one. I think while they are currently trading with Russia, they hate China culturally, as far as I know. I'm a layman here. I'm not fully informed. I'm pretty sure India hates China, and therefore they would probably align themselves with the United States. On the surface, they'd be neutral, but no one is truly neutral, especially when you're building a dichotomy between two powerful forces. You got to pick a side. Even in the third world, they were picking a side, right? Some of these third world countries went communist back in the day. So yeah, in terms of the third world, China is building a tremendous amount of influence in Africa, right? Belt and Road Initiative. I think Africa is going largely to China, in terms of these chess pieces. Where does that leave us? South America. That's an interesting one. Brazil, an up-and-coming country there, is a BRICS nation. I honestly think Brazil would go, just gut feeling, I think Brazil would go with China over the United States. To be honest. That would seem right. And then of course Mexico is going to go with the United States. They may, on the surface they may have some kind of like disagreements, but obviously it makes more sense for Mexico to go with the United States. So that's how it would work. Like, I think we're moving towards a world, right? And as these conflicts break out, you think this is global escalation. No. This is like the last ditch efforts as the new world. Putin actually used the phrase new world order. You could call it that. But he seems to think that the big players would be him, the United States, and China. And I think that's way over assuming. To think that that his country, which is on the brink of population wise, it's a disaster. Economy is just a disaster. Military is not that strong. They have nuclear weapons. Okay, like, tough guy. The United States is building a nuclear missile shield, like, in space. That's going to shoot down all the missiles. So you got nothing. And Russia is not going to be able to catch up to that because of all the reasons I said. Because their population and their, economy sucks. So, yeah, Russia's not going to be at the table there. New World Order, but it's just the United States and China and all their subsidiaries, all their proxies. But here's the thing, though. Here's the opportunity. If you move past the MAD, Cold War type of thing. And these last wars, you got Israel and Palestine, they're always fighting. You got, Israel and Iran had a little spat, and then they settled it because big dog, United States said, hey, stop it. See, that's how this works. And then Ukraine and Russia is Russia's last-ditch attempt to stay relevant. They're, we're going to fight to be relevant. You're not relevant. Nice try, This is what's going to happen, 2030s, 2040s. Watch it happen. It's just going to be United States versus China. But here's the interesting difference between that and the Cold War, right? The Cold War had this nuclear threat from both sides, so it was just frozen. It was stalled. There could be no change because both countries were too afraid to do anything except build up weapons indefinitely. But with the United States and China, I don't think it's going to go the same way. I really don't, because at the end of the day, China has always showed, I mean, I don't know whether they're going to attack Taiwan or not. It's a wild card. But China has overall always shown, like so far, they have shown that they are more interested, it seems, in like economic strength than just like, obviously they do flex their military, but they're not out here like Russia, like constantly, threatening nuclear war and doing all this stuff that's just honestly just kind of cringe. Like they're not just out here trying to like, do all that. They would probably rather trade with the United States than oppose them. So the real question is, if China and the United States can make an unsteady alliance, and the only way that would happen, not even an alliance, but just an alliance of convenience. The only way that would happen is if it was in both countries' best interest to do that. But it might just be if they say, hey, listen, America, you have your sphere. China, we have our sphere, right? Leave us alone, America, and we will leave you alone. But instead of arming against each other to the teeth, we're going to focus on our efforts on like, okay, we're going to stop these small, like when these little countries start fighting, it throws off this world order, this balance of basically just America and China siphoning wealth from these smaller countries. I mean, yeah, that's basically how this works. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to say, hey, all right, like we're going to create this new status quo where China and the US are the big boss. Nobody messes with them. And if you start misbehaving, then we're going to put you in your place. Right. And then they don't do it directly. Like, obviously they're not going to do it directly. It's too much, like too unpopular to their people aren't going to want to be constantly fighting wars. They'll do proxies. They'll say, all right, like United States will say, all right, EU, like what's going on, in, I don't know, right? Israel and Palestine are fighting again. Okay. Israel, that's America's sphere. EU, right? Like somebody, probably not the EU, but whatever. Israel is like a proxy in the region. Like, hey, listen, cut it out or we're done. We're blacklisting you. Like somebody step in, right? Somebody talk to them. China, same thing, right? North Korea starts some beef with South Korea. China's like, hey, listen, if you do that, we're not with you. So cut it out. Like you can shoot a little volley. Like you can flex you can save face for your people. You can flex a little bit, right? That's what Iran did. They fired back at like one American air base. Didn't kill anybody, I don't think. And it's like, you can do that, but then you got to go home, or else we're cutting you off from like the gravy train, right? We're not giving you any more money. So when that starts to happen, as long as the US and China can coexist without being direct enemies with each other, but rather they're just being like neutral to each other, then you're going to see a lot less global conflict break out, because soon enough, these other smaller countries are going to be realized like, oh, shoot, if I don't get in line with one of these two teams, then I'm going to get steamrolled and blacklisted from the global economy. So that is all to say to this, right? You think that America and China becoming more powerful, more nationalistic is bad for world peace. You think world peace means we need to do away with borders, we need to do away with trade barriers, and we need to just all get along and kumbaya. But like that doesn't work, because when you weaken these countries, these stronger countries, it just turns into a free-for-all for who can get to the top. There's always going to be competition. There's always going to be a fight. What you need is two dominant countries, right? You could have one dominant country, but I don't think, I think the world is just too diverse of a place. I don't think you could have one country just dominate the whole. Because, I mean, you have like, the world is split in half. You have North and South America, and then you have like the old world kind of area. Old world, that's kind of outdated. Like, Eurasia type of sphere. The world is too diverse, complex, and diverse to have just one big leader. But if you have two of them and they can both agree that world peace is in their best interest and they boss everybody around to make it so, then that's how you get there. You don't need a whole bunch of countries. You just need two. Everybody else takes their sides. It's still tribal. It's still nations, because that's how human nature works. That's why the nations formed in the first place. People collectivize. They need a common enemy. Fine. But you need somebody in line, just somebody strong at the top, keeping everybody in line, and then you will have peace. Then you're gonna have peace. You might have some terrorism here and there. Imagine America and China secretly working together because they both don't want chaos. So they're secretly working together to get rid of, terrorism, to root out terrorism and insurrectionist groups and civil wars. And other than that, but they do it through their proxies. And then it's hands off. But, those big conventional wars like Russia and Ukraine might become a thing of the past. So I don't know. Check back with me in like 2040 or 2050. I think this is a very exciting thing to see. I could go into how like technology and like the end game of that, like how that might also lead to either world destruction or world peace. But overall, honestly, I see these moves going on and I'm like, I don't think we're moving closer to World War III. I actually think we're moving closer to a potential world peace, a new world order, as Putin likes to call it. Yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. This is a fascinating topic.